Okay, if you could take your seats. We are moving along in this very exciting schedule, and I would like to introduce a good friend and a champion in the fight against the overbearing military-industrial complex. Reid Smith, who will be our moderator for the next panel, is the Director of Educational Outreach for Foreign Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. Previously, he has worked with the Cato Institute, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and the Foreign Policy Association. So our next panel will be talking about throwing a monkey wrench into the military-industrial complex. I know we touched upon the military planetoid, I like to call it sometimes, or the blob, in the last panel, and during Professor Bacevich's comments, but we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. We have a great panel here of people who represent, different aspects, the military, the bureaucracy, the State Department, the legislative, congressional complex, who are give us some deeper insights into how this blob works. I tend to think that the blob is, the military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower had predicted in 1961 in his farewell address, is really the engine of the blob. You look outside, it's what makes it all come together. And so it really is the source of energy, and perhaps we can talk about how we can throw a monkey wrench into it. So I will hand this off to Reid.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a kind introduction, although you sure gave us a tough act to follow after that last panel. So just some brief remarks, and then I'll introduce our discussants. As Kelly mentioned, in his farewell address to the nation, delivered nearly 60 years ago, President Eisenhower famously warned his fellow Americans about the evolving peril of a military-industrial complex. Allow me just to read briefly from the most oft-quoted section that's managed to lodge itself perhaps permanently in the public conscience. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. In his book, Unwarranted Influence, Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Military-Industrial Complex, written upon the 50th anniversary of the speech, the journalist James Ledbetter explained that this prophetic warning lingers as a rhetorical Rorschach blot, its meaning absorbed in the eye of the beholder. As he writes, the very utility of the phrase, the source of its mass appeal, comes at the cost of a precise and universally accepted definition. However, I think we may broadly agree that Eisenhower's speech explored the tangled web of policy and financial threads that link legislators, the armed forces, and the heavy industrial sector of the economy. The relationships are funded by political contributions, congressional appropriations, big business lobbying, slanted legislation, and very generous oversight. In 2019, America struggles under the burden of a national security infrastructure that has more than doubled since Eisenhower's term in office, yet enjoys near bottomless impunity when it comes to more spending. Justifications for these costs lack the specter of a Soviet empire. Rather, validation is achieved by waging an unwinnable war against stateless, non-uniformed adversaries and the potential hazards of a return to multipolarity. Fair enough. I think we'd all agree that real threats face the American people. However, recalling Ike, I suspect that this panel may more carefully scrutinize the influence of interested parties who derive enormous benefits from the maintenance of a permanent arms industry and a country that's forever at war nearly everywhere. So now to introduce our expert discussants, I'm going to start down at the far left. Trevor Thrall is a senior fellow and forgive me fellows for, I'm going to keep it brief. Trevor's a senior fellow for the Cato Institute's Defense and Foreign Policy Department, where he examines international security and the politics of American national security. An expert in public opinion and the U.S. arms industry, Trevor is also an associate professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, where he teaches courses in international security. To his right, Peter Van Buren is a former Foreign Service employee, a whistleblower, and the author of 2 novels and 2 nonfiction books about military affairs, including We Meant Well: How I Helped Lose the Battle for Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People. To his right, Heather Brandon Smith is FCNL's Legislative Director for Militarism and Human Rights, where she works to repeal the 01 and 02 authorizations for war, promote respect for human rights and international law, and reduce U.S. armed interventions. In addition to this very important work, she is an adjunct professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. To my left, Jeff Groom served for 8 years in the U.S. Marine Corps as an officer and a Cobra helo pilot. He published a satirical account of his experiences in uniform, American Cobra pilot, a Marine remembers a dog and pony show. He now works as an engineer in Columbus, Ohio, and is a regular contributor to the Host magazine. So I feel fortunate to be moderating a panel that is so professionally diverse: a professor of international relations, a former Foreign Service officer, an expert in the legalistic authorizations for America's war footing, and a veteran of these wars. Trevor, maybe starting down at the end, could you perhaps relay how your experience informs your understanding of what the military-industrial complex is? And maybe we can just come down the line with that question. What has your kind of education or job taught you about this kind of nebulous but important pejorative concept?
I'm already failing at the first task. Push. All right, good enough. Yeah, well, okay, so I'm an academic, so my professional experience mostly involves too much reading, I guess, which probably has led to me overcomplicating the whole concept of the military-industrial complex. But I thought we had a good introduction to it on the previous panel. The blob is obviously part of it. But I guess I would just say that to start this conversation, I mean, it's such a big beast that it's going to be hard to talk about comprehensively in an hour. But I think we should just think about 3 different dimensions of the military-industrial complex. And the first is obviously that institutional dimension. Sort of most obviously, it is the military and all the various defense industries that support it. But that's just the start, right? And you know, the institutional dimension properly helps us focus and consider a bunch of things, some of which have already been mentioned. Institutions have inertia. They are self-interested. They prefer autonomy, and so on. Another thing I would add, though, is that we shouldn't think of the military-industrial complex as just sort of local. It also includes our far-flung military base system, 800 military bases around the world. And, wherever you have a home, you start worrying about what's going on, right? And so just right there, you understand that where you put down some stuff, you're going to start worrying about things that maybe you wouldn't have worried about otherwise, right? The fact that organizations tend to like to persist instead of close their doors, even when their job is over. We've already discussed that to some degree as well. Anyway, but that's the first piece, I think, of the military-industrial complex. The second, not quite as physical, but it's the economic dimension, right? This is, you can't avoid this discussion in the military-industrial complex, but, the complex itself represents what I think is an uncomfortable blurring sometimes of the lines between public and private sector. So you have private sector motives, profit, sort of seeking public sector strategies to get it. And I think that leads to a host of issues that we certainly can talk about. And then the last thing, and this got a lot of run in the last couple of panels, is sort of the idea dimension of the military-industrial complex. I'm going to probably get this wrong, but I think Winston Churchill at one point was talking about architecture, and he said, first we build the buildings and then they build us. And so first you build a military-industrial complex because you need it. And in fact, Eisenhower's statement right before the passage you read, Reid, because I had to go back and read it too, he actually talks about how it was imperative that we build one. We have to have one. Well, certainly we do. But once you build it, the question is, what does it then do to you? And what I think it has helped do is build a very broad base of support for what I think are now very questionable strategic ideas. And yet it's such a big institution, it's so far-flung, it's so deeply entrenched that it is very difficult to challenge these ideas successfully in the public sphere because there are simply so many people defending it out loud. And so I think if we think of the military-industrial complex as sort of this three-tiered sort of beast, that's a decent way to start.
Okay. Peter, your thoughts?
I had read, not sure which to push. I had, of course, read and studied about the military-industrial complex, and
Yeah,
lighter touch. Okay, there we go. I should have. I live in New York now, so I'm used to a little more aggressive approach to these things. I'd read about the military-industrial complex, of course, in school and studied it and everything. And here in Washington, you got this kind of visual sense of it. State Department over there, Pentagon over there. But it wasn't until I went to Iraq when it actually revealed itself to me. It was almost like one of those horror movies where the first hour and a half you hear bumps in the attic and shadows moving and something in the distance, and then about 90 minutes in, the monster, reveals itself, and it turned out it was all in one room. I was there helping with the reconstruction of Iraq, State Department representative, and it was all there. There was the military guys who were explaining how we were securing freedom and democracy, and then there were the contractors who were there to sell us the things that we were going to free Iraqi people with, oftentimes generators or water purifiers or something like that. And it was like being invited to sit down to take my place as part of the military-industrial congressional research thing. And the only problem was to find how I was to fit into all of this. And it turns out that it was very easy. It was kind of like learning to use the right silverware. It's not that hard. You start from the outside and that's it. It just takes a set. And so I was there to ask for money from Washington, and as long as I played my role, then the military could do its part, and as long as the money was there, then the contractors could do their part. And the whole thing was playing itself out in real time right in front of me, and as long as I sat there and did what I was told, everything worked out quite well, as we know with the conclusion of the Iraq War.
seamless.
No, they didn't. Seamless didn't deliver out there. We were setting up a seamless program for Iraq when I had to transfer out.
Thank you, Heather.
I think it's mine on.
A light touch.
Okay, I think it's on now. All right. Yeah, so just in terms of sort of what my job has taught me about the military-industrial complex, I would just say that in the time that I've been working on these issues, there's been this sort of normalization of war. And this sort of unquestioned expansion of it. We used to see war as this exceptional thing. It gives extraordinary powers to be able to kill people as a matter of first resort rather than, arresting them, that sort of thing. So, and it's been really just kind of surprising, really, how that's just become harder and harder to fight against. This sort of concept of war being extraordinary is sort of put to the side, and it's become this sort of normal thing. And then I work with Congress a lot, and I've really seen sort of the influence that defense contractors have on Congress, sort of the power that they have. And they've been very smart about what they've done. They create jobs in the districts of the people who they want to influence. And so you have people who you would think would be quite happy to start reining in these endless wars and taking steps in those directions, but they're thinking about their constituents who, are given jobs by these industries. I've also sort of seen, the way that it's influenced the interpretation of the laws of war. The US has a very broad sort of outlier view of how the laws of war apply around the world. And it really sort of, I could get into it, maybe later on in the panel, but it really sort of helps prop up the military-industrial complex. They sort of feed into each other, and it increases the US as this outlier, but then at the same time, the US has a lot of influence around the world. So we start to see that creeping into how other countries interpret the law. And so it's really just sort of this sort of global facilitation of increased militarism around the world.
Jeff.
So my perspective from the Marine Corps, to add to what they've already said, Oliver Stone once said that in addition to the congressional industrial military complex, he mentioned the media. And today, as most people in this room probably know, the media is now a part of that. And I saw that firsthand in the Marine Corps, and that's what kind of opened my eyes to how important narrative control is to the system. And so in the military, when we report readiness, so in aviation, you have to report readiness and, how many aircraft do I have, how many are capable of flying. And because the military isn't in the business of making money, it's only in the business of killing people. And so when we report readiness, we're lying in a way in the military to hire, and we distort the actual signal that we should be sending to hire. If our planes aren't ready to fly, if we're not capable of doing the missions that we're assigned to do, we have to be honest about that, and we have a way of reporting that in the military. And when we say we're not capable of doing something, that is supposed to be the signal that then allocates resources. We need to give you less planes, more gas, more ordnance. And all the military services are in a scramble, and they're fighting each other. They're in competition with one another over, a smaller, shrinking piece of the DoD budget every year. It's a battle. And so my personal perspective that turned me kind of against it all was just the deceit that was happening at the senior levels of our military by lying to, not only to, the Congress, but then de facto to the American people. We're lying about what we're capable and not capable of doing in order to sustain ourselves.
I think that's a terrific introduction to a kind of broad and nebulous concept. I want to pivot based upon a couple things I heard from both Heather and Trevor. Heather, you remarked upon the rise of a more global militarism. Trevor, you've written extensively about the U.S. arms industry and our sales to various and sundry countries and all sorts of tin pot dictators and some absolute monarchies and all sorts of people. Can you talk a little bit maybe about what the arms sale has done to expand maybe a more militarized approach to foreign policy? And then maybe I'll let some of our fellow panelists discuss your remarks and findings.
All right. That sounds good. So yeah, I think one of the arms sales is I think, driven by one of the many strategic ideas is the nice way to say it. Myth would be maybe, in my view, a more accurate way to say it, that we hold in the United States about foreign policy and how you do it. I think presidents love arms sales because they seem like a really flexible and useful tool of foreign policy. You can kind of turn them on, you can turn them off, you can, use them as a carrot, you can use them as a stick, and they're supposed to do one of two things: either give your, partner, ally, or whatever, increased military power to do whatever it is they're supposed to do, deter or attack. But the other thing the thing you hear most about these days is they're supposed to give us leverage and influence over the recipient nations. And I think if you do a quick scan of all the countries we've been trying to influence over the last, 20, 30 years, that seems like a laugh on the surface, but it keeps being brought up pretty seriously by politicians who want to do it, and Donald Trump's no different. But I think the problem there is that the reason presidents wanted to sell arms in the first place is often because they were already captives of these other strategic sort of ideas, this idea that we have to control the whole world, the idea that we have to solve all regional conflicts, the idea that we are sort of this crusading exceptional nation that needs to bring democracy everywhere. If you really do believe those things, then you have a lot of people you need to go help, you have a lot of bad guys out there to deal with, and so you start selling weapons. Unfortunately, because we have such an effective military-industrial complex, as we've sort of been discussing, because you've already got the infrastructure in place to start selling weapons, maybe for the good causes, it turns out that we also do an awful lot of selling in cases where there really isn't any obvious strategic value whatsoever. So since 9/11, the United States has sold, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons around the world. And that's just major conventional weapons. We add several more billions for sort of handguns and other sort of smaller stuff. I think the number's somewhere around 160, 65, 67 countries. in the world. And if you try to find 167 allies and good bets out there to sell weapons to, let me know when you've got that list figured out, because I'd love to see it. And so, my conclusion from studying the pattern of U.S. arms sales has been that, sure, you can argue that some of them are strategic, NATO, maybe, right? Or, Taiwan, if you want to have a debatable sort of question, should we sell weapons to Taiwan? But then there's also sales to, Nigeria and the Congo and other places where you're sort of like, wow, I can't see that ending well. And that's not just because we believe that arms sales give us leverage, but also because industry has been very good at making the case that it's just good for the American economy. And because Congress loves donations from the arms industry, and because they often realize these jobs that, that are responsible for making these weapons are in their districts, it's very hard for Congress to ever say no to any of these things. And so basically since 1976, when the Arms Export Control Act was passed, giving Congress the power to say no to an arms deal if they didn't like it, they've never said no, not once, successfully. Now, in the case of Saudi and Yemen, they really tried. So they've really tried sort of once and didn't quite make it, so.
Actually, Heather, can you expand just a little bit on the discussion and deliberation that went on in Congress about the sale of arms to Saudi and Yemen? Just give a little bit of background on that. That's been a hot topic nigh on this past year or so.
That's a little outside my area.
Okay.
I'm really sorry.
Oh, no, that's...
Maybe somebody else.
That's totally fine. Then maybe I'll pivot to Jeff and Peter, just in your experience kind of serving on the business end of American foreign policy, what have you witnessed in terms of the positives and negatives of this outsized arms industry selling to partners, allies, and other states?
It's a good example of how the military-industrial complex creates, I guess, what we'll call groupthink. The idea would be that when you're approaching, the professor from Fletcher this morning was talking about bringing in these other tools. You've got diplomacy, you've got trade, you've got force, and arms sales are an example of how the military-industrial complex creates a groupthink, because all of a sudden you've got the salespeople coming to town, you've got the generals coming to town, and the embassy comes to a grinding halt because now what we're going to do is facilitate these arms sales. And it just takes the air out of the relationship and pumps it into this singular part. No ambassador wants to send a delegation home saying we couldn't make the sale because the State Department dropped the ball on us. Nobody wants the military to go back to Washington and say, state didn't really do its part on all this, or state was objecting to it. Something human rights. Instead, it becomes an all-hands operation that pipelines any thoughts of different opinions or bringing in the complexities of a relationship between the United States and country X and makes it a singular issue, which is arms sales. It doesn't hurt that arms sales are so measurable. It's literal numbers. Whereas most of everything else we do is hard to measure and oftentimes immeasurable. Just to build off of Trevor's comment, the other thing independent of all that, of course, is how foreign arms sales are such a wonderful way to keep the arms industry afloat. Even the United States has limits on how much it can actually spend each year, so if you can get some new customers, that allows the industry to grow at the same time.
From my perspective, when we did some exercises with the Japanese, I would say that what's bad about the relationship of U.S. arms sales is it causes some other countries to, because they trust the United States because we're the biggest, baddest kid on the block and we have the best, coolest, shiniest toys, they tend to think that like our way is the right way. And so with Japan, we helped them stand up, an amphibious force. The Marine Corps partnered with them and said, hey, look how cool we were in World War II. We did this island hopping. That's coming again because China wants to seize the equivalent of, a rock that, Tom Hanks was on in Castaway. Like, we're literally telling them that you can go seize these islands again, with our amphibious assault vehicles, which is what the Marine Corps uses. So we haven't done an amphibious assault since 1953 in Incheon, and anti-ship missiles mean we probably won't be ever doing one again, but we're still selling this idea because the U.S. Marine Corps needs this idea to exist. We're then selling this idea to other militaries that want to learn from us and possibly causing them to distort the way they're building their military up. And that's probably true with the case with Saudi Arabia, who they spend about 10% of their GDP on defense, but any expert that compares Iran and Saudi Arabia knows that the Saudi military is not nearly as good or professional as the Iranian military is. So it causes us to distort even our allies' defense spending.
As our policies have perhaps grown more militarized, has our aid simultaneously grown more militarized? Has the provision of armaments and weapons platforms crowded out other forms of maybe diplomatic largesse or other forms of exchange? Trevor, any thoughts?
You know, I wish I could answer that as factually as it demands. But I do know that sort of militarized foreign aid is up, and primarily since 9/11 to fight terrorism, sort of by, with, through, has led to a lot of military aid. I'm not sure there's been a corresponding decrease in other forms of aid. That would be the other interesting part of that. But I do think that there's a really, really vigorous debate in academic circles about whether any of that kind of aid is a good idea. There are all sorts of unintended consequences that can come with both kinds of aid. I mean, I think, you know, the unintended consequence of providing military aid is that, you know, some of the literature has found that when you train foreign militaries, for example, you increase the likelihood of a coup, right? So you strengthen the military at the sort of cost of other parts of the government. And likewise, you know, foreign domestic aid can sort of warp local economies. And so, you know, I think there's a really important question about whether or not you want, what kind of balance you want, basically.
I think one of the things that is perhaps worth focusing on is how our military-industrial complex replicates itself overseas, and aid is one of those ways to do that. Somebody has to receive what we're giving. And so if we're selling amphibious equipment to the Japanese military, they need to develop a bureaucracy to receive it. And in most cases, for example, in Japan, where I worked extensively as well, most times when the Japanese are buying a new weapon system from us, they want a joint manufacturing deal or they want a component of the manufacturing. And so, in fact, the U.S. military-industrial complex replicates itself overseas in response to the aid. What should we call it, non-lethal aid, the humanitarian aid oftentimes is delivered via the military, and sometimes that's just a matter of practicality, but it means that the people receiving it on the other end oftentimes end up being that country's military. Because, of course, military deals with military. When Jeff wants to talk about a proper place to land helicopters, he doesn't want to talk to someone in the Thai diplomatic corps. He needs to talk to someone who in the Thai military. And so you suddenly then find all these countries developing little American military-industrial complexes in response to our seed money, if you will.
So we've touched a little bit on the two of the three dimensions, I think, that Trevor laid out from the jump, the institutional industrial aspect, the sort of economic leg. I want to zero in on the ideational dimension a little bit more. And I think I want to kind of direct this question to Heather a little bit about the legal boundaries of our war authorizations and how that has perhaps changed or warped the American approach to both the world and how we do foreign policy to an extent.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, basically, current U.S. wars are largely justified under a law that was passed shortly after the 9/11 attacks. As most people in this room probably know, the 2001 Authorization for the Use of Military Force. It was passed by Congress 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, and it was signed into law exactly a week after the 9/11 attacks. You know, as we all know, Congress is the body that has the authority to declare war under the U.S. Constitution. You know, the president has a sort of limited authority to use military force without congressional authorization under Article 2 of the Constitution as commander-in-chief. But in terms of a prolonged war, that's really Congress's job. And so Congress, you know, did its job after 9/11, and it passed this authorization, this AUMF. And it was really targeted at those who attacked the United States on 9/11 and those who harbored them as well. So that's the language in the law itself. They didn't actually specifically name al-Qaeda and the Taliban, And that was because, the CIA wasn't 100% sure it was al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We didn't go into Afghanistan until October, but it was, the U.S. Congress standing behind the president saying, yes, we're going to go after those who attacked us. Now, that law has since been stretched far beyond congressional intent. It's now been used at last count from a report last year to justify 41 operations in 19 countries. And it was even used to justify going back into Iraq to fight ISIS, even though ISIS didn't exist on 9/11 and at the time was fighting against al-Qaeda. So we've really sort of seen this sort of warping of this war authority to be used to justify these wars and these expanding wars. And it's also contributed to this odd shift in the balance of constitutional war powers, I should say, where it's really supposed to be the president wants to go to war against a particular group or a country and there's a need for that. They come to Congress and Congress decides yes or no. Now we're in this kind of weird sort of legal gymnastics space where the administration looks for some way to interpret an existing AUMF to authorize expanding it to cover a new group or a new country. And as I'm sure everybody saw, apparently a few months ago, the administration came to Congress and in a closed-door briefing presented them with a justification for how this 2001 AUMF might be used to justify attacking Iran. So we're really seeing this, kind of out-of-control expansion of this legal war authority without any real sort of end in sight. Congress has been very resistant to actually acting to rein this in and to take back its war powers. So it's pretty troubling, and it really does sort of feed into everything else that we're talking about now, the sort of over-militarized approach and war being normal.
So if it has warped perhaps this deliberative body's approach to foreign policy and perhaps further militarized and already unencumbered executive branch, Trevor, I'm curious to learn a little bit about Gen Pop and America's attitudes about maybe foreign policy, how it could be conducted, where the military-industrial complex may play into that. This is your wheelhouse, so I'm curious to learn.
That's a broad question. So, I think some of this was touched on before. I think, polling over the last at least 6-7 years has shown that the American public is sort of increasingly on a different page from Washington about especially the pointy end, the military intervention end of U.S. foreign policy. There's the Trump years have been a little weird looking at polls because there's been this sort of kind of these weird Trump backlashes and this sort of extra tribalism that makes interpreting the polls a little tricky. But I think in general, the United States public is a lot more cautious about the benefits and a lot more worried about the costs of military intervention than Washington, D.C. And I think you saw that in the public's reluctance to support any kind of intervention in Syria. And I think, Monica brought up the fact that 2/3 can't put North Korea on a map of Asia. Well, I don't know if you remember this, but this exact same question was asked about Syria in like 2012 or something like that. And of course, the same number couldn't figure out where Syria was either. And that's kind of a recurring theme. So number one, the United States public would prefer not to care, which is, too bad maybe for us who like it, but that's just the way it is. They don't know much about it, but they'd rather not start so much. I think that's the sort of number one thing. I think there's lots of running room for political leaders who want to tone down that side of things.
So I think we're sort of tasked by our panel's title to throw a monkey wrench in the military-industrial complex, and we've certainly painted a rich and broad picture of a complicated set of institutions, economic incentives, and perhaps even the psychic component as well too. I defer to your expertise here. How may we resolve one or several aspects of this question at hand? And then I think it's probably time to open it up for Q&A, given that we're running a little bit behind from our preceding panel. No one wants to jump on this one, huh?
I'll jump.
Okay.
I'll jump. One of the things I think, if you study public opinion, one of the things that you cannot escape is that the American public is very dependent on elite cues. They look to Washington and their parties, leaders, the people they trust, to kind of give them the memo, where should I be standing? Sometimes it takes them a while to get that memo, so you have to repeat things a lot. But one of the things that the previous panel made very clear is that there is not a very broad debate in D.C. about foreign policy typically. It's pretty narrow. And what that means is all of the American public is getting the same memo. Both teams are probably getting about the same memo. And so they, have very little sort of choice. Their menu is pretty constrained. I think what needs to happen to throw a monkey wrench into this is for political leaders, people getting elected to Congress, presidents, disagreeing with each other about the direction of foreign policy. And I think we're at an interesting moment where we're seeing more fraying of this sort of consensus that we've had than we've ever seen, at least in the last 30 years. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more of it. I think if you look at the Democratic Party, there's definitely some fissures there between sort of the really progressive side of things and the more sort of liberal internationalist standard. And I think, that kind of debate, if it actually turns into a debate between Republicans and Democrats, could be a start.
One thing that's of concern is the ability of the military-industrial complex, and Jeff wanted to add media to that. Mm-hmm. I fully subscribe to that idea, to sort of build scar tissue around new information. And I'm talking in particular here about the role of whistleblowers. We have, during, for example, the Obama administration and the Bush administration, a number of people who tried to desperately tell us about what the NSA was doing, that they had embarked post 9/11 on a massive campaign of domestic surveillance. And the ability of the system to sort of swallow those people up. If people in the room are familiar with folks like Bill Binney or Tom Drake, and if you're not, then the complex has done its job quite well. Tried to tell us that the NSA was in a position to surveil everyone, and the information just went away. It was like dropping water into the sand in the desert. Even when Edward Snowden came out with literal documentation of this, the system sort of formed around the documentation, swallowed it up, discredited a little bit here, pushed it aside there, complicated matters over here, and suddenly it just kind of went away. I myself, apparently in today's vocabulary, was a very small monkey wrench, a lot heavier on the monkey than the wrench side. I tried to expose waste and mismanagement in the reconstruction program in Iraq, and I was scar tissue formed around me to keep me as quiet as possible, to limit my ability to do change when I was on the ground in Iraq, and then to talk about that change when I came home. And the ability of the system to do that was actually very impressive. I didn't think I was actually even important enough to require an immune response from the system. But it takes good care of itself, and I think our willingness to treat whistleblowing as flexibly as we do. In other words, if the current political climate says what the whistleblower is revealing is good news, we're going to listen to it. From my perspective, good or bad news. And if it's criticizing, gets a little too close to the guts of the system, then we're going to find a way to block it off. Makes that monkey wrench thing very, very hard to do. You can't do it without information. And we seem to have a system in place to limit the new information.
Peter, would you be so kind as to, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't pull on this thread just a little bit more. In your experience as a whistleblower, can you maybe describe a little bit more in detail about the, let's call them the white blood cells that were deployed to inoculate the system or whatever?
Well, Andy, could you help me sell a book here? Because I've got one, sorry, joke.
Yeah.
Okay, actually you did. I tried when I was in Iraq to bring this problem that we were wasting money. We were buying the wrong things. We were creating corruption. It's a whole list of what happens when you're blind, deaf, dumb, and extremely rich in a thing. I very quickly was explained to me that this wasn't something to blow the whistle on. It was sort of what the policy was, and I just needed to get with the program. When I came back to the United States and tried to interest anyone in this idea. I contacted all members of Congress, and the only person who responded to me was Ron Paul's office, including my own representatives who I didn't even get a letter back saying thank you for your interest. Go away. The media was interested in it only really as a bit of, oh, look, somebody's sticking their head up. Let's watch his head get whacked off. That'll be fun. You know, it was gladiatorial. And certainly my own organization, the Department of State, really had no interest in dissenting opinions. It's a long story, and it's been covered well on the American Conservative and really nowhere else. But it was a series of things that eventually saw me threatened with jail, threatened with financial destruction, and eventually thrown out to the point where I currently write for TAC and also work as a professional pizza guide, because it's very hard to get a job when your name comes up on a Google search in certain ways.
I would add for the to throw a monkey wrench in the military-industrial complex. I think something that the people in this room are good at doing, but American society at large is not, is portraying our movement as a defense of the military itself, because we say the military-industrial congressional complex, but really the military is a victim of this system. And really, it's not a beneficiary anymore. In the Cold War, we could say it was. Today, it's being exploited in a lot of ways. And what the blob does is they take the military and they put the military up front and they hide behind it and they say, how dare you, not support the troops, unpatriotic conservatives. That was a very, successful strategy, but it was, obviously incorrect. But I think if the way to stop it is to get the military back into our corner and say that, we are defending the institution of the military. It's not good that they have too many planes, broken planes, too many tanks. Like, that's not good for them. So by, derailing it, we're actually doing something positive for the military, which is a much more popular play with the American people because everyone loves the military, right?
Yeah, so I would just add that what can really be done to throw a wrench into the military-industrial complex is to do something about the current AUMFs that are still on the books. So obviously that would be something that Congress has a lot of power to do right now, to take back their constitutional war powers, and that, constituents talking to their representatives, talking to their senators and telling them that this is something that is important to them could have a real role to play. So, there are some sort of unprecedented opportunities to deal with these. I talked about the 2001 AUMF. There's also the 2002 Iraq AUMF, which was used to justify the Iraq war, really against Saddam Hussein, and the supposed weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to exist. But that law has been sort of repurposed by not just this administration, but the Obama administration as well, as this sort of, establish a stable democratic Iraq AUMF, which now the Trump administration said last year authorized them to use force against threats to and from Iraq. Which could mean, if a threat to Iraq could mean Iran, could mean another country, could mean another group that Congress never intended. And there's an opportunity now in the National Defense Authorization Act. The House version of that has a provision to repeal that law, the 2002 Iraq AUMF. It's not needed for any current operations, but the way it's been interpreted, it could certainly be abused and used to try and justify a new conflict that Congress never intended. So that is something that Congress could really do to take back its constitutional war powers, say, and put a stop to this sort of ever-expanding militarization and sort of endless wars around the globe.
Well, I'm grateful for those finite recommendations from our distinguished panelists. With that, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. If you'd be so kind as to ask your question in the form of a question and introduce yourself as well, too, please. Many thanks.
Absolutely. My name is Andrew. I'm here from Notre Dame, the John Quincy Adams Society there. And my question is, and I'd love to hear each panelist's opinion on this, when the Eisenhower farewell address is made and its solemn warning, I know that defense expenditures represented something like nearly half the entire federal budget. And today, that's less than a quarter, and defense acquisition, another fraction of that. Is it still fair to use the Eisenhower kind of panic about the military-industrial complex when, historically speaking, we're actually spending less than ever on our defense acquisition compared to entitlement programs like Social Security and others?
Any takers?
That's a great question. I think, Eisenhower's warning was certainly triggered by the fact that carrying that kind of budget into peacetime, along with a large standing army, was unprecedented for the United States. But I don't think that lessens or sort of means that we don't have a problem today. It's still really big. Millions of people, hundreds of military bases, right? Wars everywhere. How many places are we bombing sort of today? Volume has a quality all of its own, and I'm not saying it wouldn't be worse if it was that big. It would be, but I think it's still pretty bad today.
I mean, I guess I would just ask the question, is this working?
Yeah.
Is this approach, this really expansive militarized approach working? Is it making the United States safer? Is it making the world safer? Is it really achieving what it's, supposedly intending to achieve? And I would say there's a lot of evidence out there to say, no, it's not. We're in this sort of situation where, we've been fighting these wars for over 18 years, and the threat to U.S. national security has only increased. So I think that you have to look at things that way and say, okay, what are our other options there? Are some other resources being underutilized, and do we need to look in a different direction to achieve U.S. security goals?
I don't believe the percentage includes the fact that, I don't know, but I don't think it includes war spending. So I think Brown University did a study and said since the war on terrorism began, we spent something like $5 to $6 trillion on wars. So that's a not insignificant chunk of change. But personally, why I'm not really so much as the money piece is important, but to me, it's more about the moral issue and what it's doing to us as a country. By continuing this narrative, we are changing the way we live or giving up our liberties in the name of, the odds you die in a terrorist attack in the USA are the odds you drown in a bathtub every year. And is that enough to justify NSA spying on people, all these other things that are happening now in the name of something that's not even real? So to me, it's not so much about money as it is about what the narrative is doing to the moral fabric of our country.
And that sums it up. It's a matter of influence on our society. It's not something that's only measurable in dollars and cents. As Jeff pointed out, it's part of the reason that we have no privacy anymore. It's part of the reason that we don't have money for X, Y, or Z because we're spending it over here. It also, I think, a lot of the numbers misunderstand how much of the rest of the U.S. government, the non-military part of the government, is engaged in acts that support the military. Just one of the examples we talked about here, for example, the State Department's role in Iraq and Afghanistan and the State Department's role in arms sales. Those aren't counted probably in those numbers, but represent a big chunk of the budget that ends up one way or the other servicing the military-industrial complex.
Next up.
Hello. I have a question. I'm a senior at the Elliott School at GW, just a few neighborhoods over. My question is specifically about arms sales. The panel covered sales to state actors very effectively, but my question is also how necessarily to rein in arms sales to non-state actors, which the U.S. also does. I don't know if that's covered under the 1976 Act. Does Congress need to authorize it, or is that more left at the discretion of the Pentagon? And I think that this is an equally important part of the discussion, given the fact that, especially most recently in northeastern Syria, of the militias that attacked that have moved in, I believe that at least 21 of them were funded by the United States, and 14 of which are equipped with advanced anti-tank missiles. So I was curious about how necessarily to rein in those arms sales as well as ones to state actors.
It's an important question. Thoughts?
I would just say, we don't sell weapons to non-state actors. We give them to them. So there's that. so we don't even make any money, man. It's just a bummer. But no, I mean, you raise a really important point. But that, we've been doing that for many, many decades, longer than you've been alive. And if we had this panel back in the late 80s, we could have talked about the sales to the Contras, right? Or not the sales, the gifts, I suppose. To me, any of the risks that you run selling weapons to governments that you think are a little sketchy is amplified, many-fold when you're talking about moderate rebels. Anytime you hear the phrase moderate rebel, you should run.
Bravo. Next question, please.
Hi. Okay. Hi, I'm Hans Klein from Georgia Tech. I have two questions. One is I was struck by Peter Van Buren's anecdote about being targeted by antibodies. That was actually kind of scary, a little surprising. And I'm wondering if other people have had similar experiences of that kind of pushback. First question. Second question is, there's a theme here generally of the importance of ideas and public opinion. And I'd be very interested to hear people elaborate on a communication strategy as a means of pursuing some of the goals that are discussed here. This is already a communications event right here. TAC is very significant. We're seeing books. Are there other ways that could advance that? And I would say that, as Trevor knows, I just invited him to a conference we're doing at Georgia Tech on political warfare and information warfare that looks at the informational dimension of some of these issues. But I'm wondering if others see an information strategy in this. Thank you.
As to the question of antibodies, I lost my job. Jeff Sterling went to jail. John Kiriakou went to jail. Lots of other, Chelsea Manning went to jail. Ed Snowden is in Moscow in whatever, as a refugee of some kind. These antibodies sting quite severely. There's lots and lots of other people who raised the alarm, blew the whistle at much lower levels, who simply fade away. This is a very active and productive system. Most of the people that I served in the State Department, just as an example of how this can reach out, most of the people that I worked with alongside my class, if you will, you retire on Friday and then you get hired back as a contractor of some sort, or they have a thing called when actually employed, which is kind of like part-time work. Or if in other places, if you're a little smarter and a little higher up, you get picked up by a sympathetic think tank or academic institution and things like that. But when you blow the whistle, when you're a troublemaker, if you're lucky enough to avoid jail or you're lucky enough to avoid some type of personal crisis that kind of takes you off the board, there's plenty of ways to defund you, to push you aside, particularly in a situation as chummy as the military-industrial academic media complex. They all talk to each other. They all know who each other is, and there's a good boy and a bad boy list out there, just like Santa uses every Christmas. And there's plenty of gifts for the people who have done the right things, and plenty of ways for people who haven't. A lot of the people that were in charge of the programs I criticized are still either in government or, in fact, doing much better working in the private industry as contractors in Afghanistan, supervising identical programs that failed in Iraq. So the antibodies work in many ways. Reminds me of the gangsters in Thailand. Unlike what you see on TV, they used to say, they'd go up to people they were trying to influence and say, do you want the bullet or the Benz? And they'd have a pistol in one hand and car keys to a brand new car in the other. There were plenty of ways to solve a problem, and if you figured out how to play along, it was a whole lot better to drive away in a brand new car than to have your wife set one less place at dinner.
Just in terms of the information strategy, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but just sort of ways to get this information more out there or to influencers. It's interesting because we have a strong grassroots base where I work. And what we hear is when they go and they talk to their senators and representatives or their staff, very few people go and lobby their representatives on foreign policy issues. It's largely domestic issues that they're hearing from their constituents on. So I think there just needs to be more people, who do know about this stuff, because the separate issue is getting that information to people, but going and talking to their members of Congress, and then also writing about it, writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds in local papers, sort of getting that information out there as a way of influencing decision makers. And I'd also say unlikely allies is a good way of being able to publicize this issue. And one partnership that I'm thinking of right now on the endless war and the AUMF repeal issue is actually a veterans effort between Concerned Veterans for America and Vote Vets, who I heard the story yesterday that they actually came together on the need to end these endless wars and, repeal the AUMFs, they were on a TV show talking about an entirely different topic, and someone called in with a question about this, and they discovered that they actually had exactly the same view. And so they decided to team up on this. And I think that, so I guess part of that is, forming these unlikely relationships, because they will generate publicity, but also then listening to the people who you think you might not agree with, or, or forming those relationships with them to see where you do have common ground.
Just building on Heather's point, very grateful for the partnership between our colleagues at at Concerned Veterans for America and our friends at CVA. The final point I would make is that sort of unlikely alliance speaks to different audiences, and this may seem like an obvious point, but when you're talking to, kind of a Republican or conservative audience, perhaps focus on waste, fraud, and abuse might get you further than what you're losing from other discretionary spending and entitlement for your friends on the Democratic side of the aisle. So, yeah, being able to kind of harness that Ricardian comparative advantage of speaking to different people with the message they need to hear is of the utmost importance. So, thanks for the question.
Hi, my name's Brian. I'm a journalist with the Globe Post. I just have a quick question for Heather. I understand that the House actually has passed a repeal of the AUMF this year. Barbara Lee, who was the sole vote against the 2001 AUMF, successfully added an amendment to an appropriations bill. Of course, though, that's unlikely to make its way through the Senate as well, and I'm just curious if you're aware of any broader effort or appetite to take another look at the AUMFs in Congress now?
So that's a great question. So yeah, absolutely, that's true. So in the committee, the House Appropriations Committee adopted on a party line vote a provision from an amendment from Barbara Lee it would actually sunset the 2001 AUMF after 8 months, so that would be intended to give Congress time to sort of figure out, what should happen next. Should we continue any of these current wars? What should we do? So, I mean, there is a sort of growing movement in this space that, we need to do something about these AUMFs. I mean, we did a letter in support of that provision. We had 54 groups sign on. And I know that there are other groups who also support this but didn't sign on to that particular letter. So it has been interesting. We've sort of been working on this all year at FCNL to see the increase in support for doing something about the 2001 AUMF. Again, as you said, I'm not really sure, what bodes for the future of that. I think the provision that has a stronger chance of getting through is the provision in the House version of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF. That provision was not passed in committee. It was on the House floor. It was a bipartisan vote. It was 242 to 180. And, there is very broad bipartisan support for that provision. The Heritage Foundation came out with a report where they supported it. Speaking of what Reid was saying about going into different offices and talking to different people with the right set of information, it's been a really great opportunity to educate people about this law and why it should be repealed. So, we're sort of waiting with bated breath to see what happens with that. But I think that once you have addressed one AUMF, once you have repealed one AUMF, then it's going to increase the opportunities to do something about the other ones. So I feel that something is building in this space.
Thanks.
Exciting developments. Another exciting development is it looks like lunch is on the horizon here. So I want to take these last two questions as a 1-2 punch, if that's okay with our panelists, so we can sort of maximize efficiency here. So please.
Hi, my name's Dwight. I'm one of millions of lawyers in the country required to take continuing legal education seminars. And there's not a whole lot out there that would talk about issues of war and peace, war powers clause, and also international law, which I view these as constraints on that are good for us. But anyway, my question is, do you think there's a role for continuing legal education to spread ideas, to take law seriously? Maybe because courts punt on these issues, don't want to get involved. Maybe lawyers think there's no role, that it's not serious law, but I think it is serious and would like to see more education and wanted your opinion on that. Both to defend veterans, as Jeff said, about being victims. I mean, there's no standing for people to get into the courts, but is there a role for law?
Okay, that's our first question.
Okay, my name is Colette, and I have a question for Peter. And I was wondering, when you titled your book, We Meant Well, who were you referring to? The Bush administration or the people that were trying to clean up afterward?
Okay, you want to take that question first, Peter, and then continuing legal education to follow.
Yeah, this is kind of the grassy knoll of my life. The title "We Meant Well" was supposed to be sarcastic. I rarely does a week go by when someone doesn't contact me with some threat or unnatural act saying, we didn't mean well at all. So for once at all, the true story is it was meant to be sarcastic. Y'all just calm down.
We now have it on record. That's excellent. Public forum and all that. Heather?
Yeah, on the continuing legal education question, yes, absolutely. I think there should be continuing legal education on war powers and the constitutional division of war powers and international law, because the two bodies of law, there's a ton of interplay there. And the expertise in Congress isn't always where you would want it to be when the big decisions come up. I think AUMF is sort of perceived as this very in-the-weeds legal wonky thing, but people only turn their attention to it when it's right in front of them. Whereas if there was this requirement to constantly update their legal knowledge, then you wouldn't have this sort of mad scramble whenever something suddenly comes up and you have to explain to people, this is what this actually says. So yeah, absolutely, I think that would be great.
So with that, I want to thank our expert discussants, but it wouldn't be a panel without an audience, so thank you all for being here as well, too.